It's Dr. Parikh again. Chapter 3 of Writing with Style with Lenore Szuchman. Page 25. She talks about sort of what level to aim at for your introduction, because you don't want to completely reinvent the wheel, but you also don't want to assume a lot of knowledge. I would say when you're writing, assume that this person has heard of the topic before. For this class, I would say assume they heard a little bit about it, like in an introductory psychology class, or that they do a lot of reading and kind of keep up with things. I imagine my grandma. My grandma didn't do any college, any formal college. She wanted to, but it wasn't an option for her at the time. And so she has no formal education in psychology, but she does a ton of reading. She loves science, and so she can follow just about anything as long as you break it down and make it clear, make it kind of almost conversational. And so when I'm writing and I'm kind of stuck and not sure what to write to, I'll often pull up a separate document and just kind of start free writing and really imagine talking to my grandma. And so think of someone who's like that. It might be your roommate, it might be a classmate, it might be a family member who kind of keeps up with the basics of things, but who doesn't know a lot about your specific topic yet. And you also want to really think about where, with number 2, think about where this new work fits in. So you don't need to tell me, let's say you're writing something about depression. Ugh, sorry, I've got a hair that is, there we go. Let's say you're writing about depression. There's so much to depression. You're not going to give me a whole primer on depression. You may talk a little bit about the symptoms, the prevalence, but mostly it's kind of a need to know basis. What foundation blocks do I logically need to know to be able to follow what you really want to tell me about? So that was page 25. Page 26, APA style guide. It talks about, Szuchman talks about some of the sort of the nuts and bolts of how do you put this paper together. Later on that page 26, she talks about sorry, I have no idea what my notes mean now. Sorry, I got completely lost there. The first sentence, I'll just kind of move on. She talks about the first sentence of an article. And, I just figured out what my note meant. So a lot of, Szuchman recommends looking at the first few paragraphs of a paper to see what the article was about. Sometimes this actually gets hidden in the last 1 or 2 paragraphs. Which is hard because you've taken me through all this. A literature review is really throwing a lot of information at the reader. And if I don't know where we're going, if I don't have a map in my head of what the ultimate goal is here, it's really hard for me to file that information away well as we move through. And so you want to make sure it's so easy to put at the end of your paper what really should go at the beginning. And one of the things I recommend is to, there's a few ways that we avoid this. One is on the paragraph level, because people do the same thing. I do it all the time. I find that my perfect topic sentence is actually the last sentence I stuck at the end of the paragraph. And so I just move it up to the front and it works great. And so one of the things we do is we write an outline for this class that has you specifically say, what is my topic sentence going to be, so that you think about what am I trying to say with this paragraph instead of just kind of blindly writing and seeing what comes out. And then also, first sentences, she talks a lot about what makes a good first sentence. These can be really intimidating, and I don't want you to get stuck with the blank page syndrome. The hardest part of writing is getting started. And so rather than obsessing about that first sentence, just write, start from the middle of that paragraph. or just kind of start with pieces and then start piecing them together and then go forward. One of the advantages of the way we do the outline is that you do a lot of the scary work conceptually first, and then all you have to do is kind of fill in the blanks, just finish writing out the paragraphs you've planned. And that's a very new style of writing for most people. So yeah, if the first sentence is really hard to write, just wait until the end when you have a better idea where you're going. And know that it's likely going to take a few drafts to get something that you're really happy with. Page 27, it talks a little more about, at the very top, it's talking about hypotheses. You're not going to need hypotheses for the first paper you do, for the literature review, but when we move on to the experimental paper, you are going to write hypotheses. And while you're finishing up that literature review, you're going to simultaneously be working out what do you want your research questions to be. How are you going to move from this literature review into a research proposal? So you'll need that later. And I underlined here on page 27, by the time the literature has been reviewed, the author is supposed to be able to support the hypotheses with something more convincing than his or her original hunch. Sorry if you hear sirens in the background. I couldn't pay attention to my own sentence. By the time the literature has been reviewed, the author is supposed to be able to support the hypotheses with something more convincing than his or her original hunch. So part of the way you'll develop your hypotheses is saying, what am I really moving toward in this literature review? What seems logical at the end of it? What have I proved? Not proved, because proved is a dirty word, but what have I created support for? And then I also underlined, this process is implicit in the entire literature review contained in the introduction. And so it's the idea, this is the whole point. The whole point of your literature review is to support a viewpoint, a conclusion for the literature review paper. And then for the research paper, it's really, the literature review is all about explaining and supporting the hypotheses. And then kind of prepping to make sense, to create a context for whatever the findings would be if you were actually doing the research. One thing I want to talk about is terms. Literature review versus introduction. I have a bad habit because a literature review is a paper that reviews the literature. So you're not doing research, you're just giving a summary of what's existing in the literature. That's what you're writing first. I use the term literature review and introduction a little interchangeably, which is probably a bit of a bad habit, especially when I'm teaching, because for you guys, you're trying to figure out what's what, and it's confusing if I use the same term to mean different things, or two different terms to mean the same thing. So in a research article, the introduction is the part of the paper that talks about the work that's been done before or reviews the literature. Sometimes it's called a literature review, sometimes it's called an introduction, sometimes it's not labeled at all, but it's that it always is what's first. Page 28 is where Szuchman starts to talk about what is a literature review versus an experimental paper. So that's helpful to know because you're writing both. Page 29, she talks about how to choose a topic, and she talks about how to use Google. You can't really use Google to find your articles. Once in a while you find one, but it's not very reliable. But it can be great to learn a little bit about a topic. Wikipedia is a great resource for informal research. And you can even try to use their references to find some articles to get you started. It's not something you can ever cite in a scholarly way. But it's great for exploring quickly. Page 30, she talks about how to understand scholarly sources, and we will meet with Ellen from the Psych Library to learn more about that. Page 31, she talks about how to take article notes. You're not required to use this format for our notes, but it's something that might be useful. Or you may not use the entire format, but you might take, a couple pieces from it. Page 32. So I make this comment a lot when I'm grading literature review papers. Not a serial book report. This is not a serial book report. And what I mean by that is I don't want you to tell me first all about your first article, then all about your second article, then all about your third article. And this is ridiculously easy to happen. It's so common, and people lose a lot of points over it, especially when I tell them you're doing this and you need to fix it. It's really hard to justify that you have completed a thorough revision of your paper if you're still looking like a serial book report. One thing I have you do, I have you take notes and make bullet points of interesting ideas. And then the goal is to look at the ideas instead of the articles and try to see how the ideas sort of group into themes. So thinking in terms of themes instead of in terms of articles. It's always going to be easiest to think in terms of articles because that's how you're reading them, that's how they're grouped, it's logical. But I want you to go beyond that because you're not just giving me 3 article summaries in a row. You're creating a new idea. And that's why I love teaching this writing course because you're creating a new idea, something that has never existed. And I am completely genuine about my excitement for this. This is my favorite part of the process, is watching students figure out what they want to say about this topic. And my favorite part is that we can look at the same article notes. I can have them tell me what are the most important things from your articles, and we'll look at the same keywords. And I'll kind of have something going in my head of how they could structure it, and they have something completely different. And that process is so magic to me. It's so intoxicating. And so it's so important to make sure you're going beyond, here's one article, here's another, here's another. I underlined in the second paragraph on page 32, you should not summarize exhaustively every study in your review. If you notice that you're giving a lot of details about each study, you might be writing a serial book report instead of a literature review. You are going to logically need more details for some studies than others. You're going to have some articles that contribute a lot, some that contribute a little less. You're only using, I think, 4 to 5 articles, so you will use each of them kind of heavily. But if you were writing, when you get to upper level classes where you're writing things with, say, 8 articles, not all 8 can be major contributors. It just doesn't make sense. And so think about what you actually need from each article to say what you want to say. The bottom of that, page 32, organize your notes. You want to try to think about how to organize them. Keep in mind the point you're making about each study, and focusing on what is the main point of this study in terms of how I want to use it. So it's not really just what is the main point of the study. It's what is the main point that I want to make about this study. And to help you do that, we use a lot of topics, sentences, and outlines. You'll do a really structured outline for my course. One of the best tips I got in grad school was to take your notes, print them out, one on each, like space between each idea, and then cut them up, like physically cut them up and start sorting them into piles. And as you sort them and maybe resort some things, then figure out what is the theme or the topic of each pile. And that's a way to really help you divide things up. Make sure you cite before you start to cut, because otherwise you'll have a miserable process of trying to remember where things came from. Which is why one of the reasons when you write your notes, you're going to do a citation at the end of each and every one. Page 33, you want to show the connections among the studies. You're really showing that's another good way to know that you're avoiding a serial book report, is that you're talking about how each study relates to the other. And then I underlined knowing why you are including a particular study will give you a much better idea of where to include it. So as you're making your article notes, you might even paraphrase a sentence, so paraphrasing an idea from that article, and then afterward, include your citation so that you can just copy and paste that sucker right into your paper later. And then make a note after, like in parentheses or italics or something, saying why you like that idea, how, kind of what it is that you think that idea shows. At the bottom of the page, they talk about verb tense. Then on page 34, they talk about headings. You can get a lot of guidance on headings from the template. Really, for me, I try to keep it really straight and simple, so I suggest you choose 2 to 3 themes. 2 tends to work better. 3 is okay, though, if it makes sense for you, and kind of divide everything. And some people have sub-themes. Sometimes there's just paragraphs underneath that. It all is going to depend on how you want to communicate. But headings are a great way to help the reader. They're signposts. They tell me when you've changed big thoughts. Also, page 34, the next paragraph talks about an outline and how an outline can help you break down your ideas. And one thing I want to remind you is that an outline is an iterative process, just like all of writing. Iterative is a word that means you do it over and over again. You go back. Just like how, theories create hypotheses, which lead to data, which then are interpreted to sort of reform the theory, create new hypotheses. It's a circle. Outlining, you're going to keep adjusting. You're going to find that it's not working and scrap it. When I was writing my dissertation, I redid the entire layout. Sorry, another siren. I did the entire layout 3 times. I don't think I spoke to my advisor for a while after she told me to redo it the 3rd time, but it did make the paper better. Page 35, the note that I have in the margin is use the daggum template. I can tell when students didn't use the template because they make really simple mistakes that cost them a lot of points. When you think about the literature review, sort of near at the bottom of page 35, they're kind of talking about literature review still. And you will need to transition to as you're writing, you need to keep in mind there is going to be this transition. You're going to need to develop research questions or hypotheses. We'll talk more about the difference between those later. And so you want to design the literature review with the experimental paper in mind. Page 36, the second full paragraph down, talks about organizing the paper, always being the most challenging part. And it is. And once you know the organization, students have told me once they have the outline, writing the rough draft is really one of the easiest steps in the process. Because your article notes makes the outline easier. The outline, it can be intimidating, but we're going to do some things in class. We're going to do a concept map. We'll do several exercises that will help you with organizing your ideas. And I have time set aside to meet either in groups or individually at that point. Because if you can get a strong organization, the strong paper just follows. One thing I'm really big on is what's called a roadmap paragraph. It's a first paragraph, so the very first paragraph of your paper. So you got title page, abstract, and then you have the body starting with your title, and then the first paragraph under that I call a roadmap paragraph, and it really should set up there should be a sentence or 2 to hook me in and tell me why this topic is important, and then you should have a sentence that sort of summarizes each main idea or theme, and then a sentence to kind of transition me into the paper. It's a very formulaic paragraph. And like I said before, it's really hard for me to follow a paper, for any reader to follow a paper if I don't know the point that you're trying to make because you're throwing so much information at me. The roadmap helps a lot with that. Page 37. This reminded me a lot. Again, I love the magic. I love how different people can come up with different maps, different outlines from the same main concepts. It's the magic of writing to me. Page 37, one important thing to know is that I use a very specific structure for how to do your discussion section. So you have the literature review, and then you have a discussion section. And we do limitations, then practical applications, future research, and conclusions. And that's the way that a lot of professors structure it, so I'm going to stick with that. So limitations is, what are the limitations either of individual studies or of the body of research as a whole? For example, systematic issues like not enough diversity in the sample. That's almost always an easy one to find some way that the sample's not really generalizable. Or a specific, nothing is longitudinal. So it's all just looking at people in the moment and not really following them over time to see what happens. Next is practical applications, which is one of the tricky ones for people until they really get what it's getting at, which is how do people out in the real world doing their jobs do their jobs differently based on this information? It's almost always going to apply to therapists, counselors, but it can often apply to social workers, primary care doctors, psychiatrists, nurses, teachers, sometimes clergy, other people in the community who work. If it's something with college students, it might be professors or higher ed administrators. So just thinking who should use this information to do their job better. And you want to stay really close to what your main points were. So for example, if your paper was on depression, you're going to have a more specific subtopic, and your practical applications need to deal with that subtopic. So let's say your paper was on sun lamps to help treat seasonal depression. You wouldn't do generic like people sometimes benefit from medication, or keeping a gratitude journal can help with depression. And it can, but that's not really logical with what you've just told me about sun lamps. Like either tell me that medical professionals should be encouraging it or should not. Say that, college health centers should keep them on hand if it's found to be helpful. You want it to be clearly linked with the work you did. Future research, now it's weird because you've got limitations, then practical applications, and then future research, which is really limitations with a twist. Because future research is where you say, if I complained that there's not enough ADHD research with girls, it's too focused on boys, then that would be a limitation. And then my future research would be to say, future research should include more girls. It's really easy to write future research once you have good limitations. There's this weird gap, but it seems like other professors structure it that way, and so I want to be as consistent as possible. And then the final section is conclusions, where you just do a wrap-up. Basically, the literature review is hard, and the rest of the paper is pretty formulaic. That is my ending note. Bye.